But I'm going to start by telling y'all, my name's Cort, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about me. In the summer of 2016, I transferred to UTD and started studying sound design here. Loved that. I got plugged in to Focus at Collin College a couple years before that, and so when I transferred that summer, I spent that time going to summer Focus, meeting UTD students, getting connected, so that when I started in the fall, I was just already home, and that ended up going pretty well. But if we fast forward from that to after fall camp, I'm meeting one-on-one at Wendy's with my core Sean, and we were just talking about normal stuff, mainly about our core, but then he stops me and he's like, wait, I have a question for you. Do you know Daniel Kalina? I want you to be friends with that guy. And I did know Daniel Kalina, at least of him. I knew he was a guy that Sean had studied FOJ with the last year because he was in Sean's core. I knew he was a core for that year. And I knew he was a fellow ATech student like myself, mainly because I had met him hanging around the other ATech students that I knew. But since I didn't know him as a friend and because I wanted to be a good, obedient core member, I went to a Friday like one of these. I think it was at Founders North, if I remember correctly. But I walked up to Daniel, and I exchanged pleasantries with him, and then I was like, hey, so Sean told me that he wants us to be friends, so do you want to set up time to hang out and get to know each other? Not at all my best invitation to friendship ever, but I think it ended up being a pretty good one because, one, Daniel found it very funny that I asked him that way, but he also agreed. So effective strategy, friend made. And it didn't take much of our meeting to figure out that Sean was a pretty good matchmaker. During our time together, Daniel and I, first connection point that we obviously had was we're both in Focus. And so we talked about the course we were in, talked about friends we had from the ministry, and then we moved into talking about what we were studying. He was a game designer, I was a sound designer, I was interested in games, and so we talked a lot about those. We talked a lot about why we liked the design fields that we liked. We talked a lot about the games we like and how those shaped what we were interested in doing. And what about the design of those games has really inspired a lot of what we were working on. Out of that flowed this desire to really help sharpen each other in these skills. We did a lot of that together. But Daniel and I, like I said, we were not only just connected on our love for design, we were also connected on our love for God. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that as well. And out of, that 1.5-ish hour meeting came a friendship that, I still hold as one of my most important ones today. Daniel and I spent a lot of time together over the 4 semesters that we shared at UTD. A lot of that spent working on projects together, whether the same project in the same class or different projects, and giving each other feedback on those. We spent a lot of time talking about what we thought about God, what we thought about how, a lot of people want to find meaning in the work they do, and what is that meaning for designers, and how we can see that God is a designer and what all that meant for us. And all of that was really meaningful and really shaped a lot of who I would grow and become over my time at UTD. It was just very important to me. In the spring of 2018, Daniel and I did our capstone together for ATech, and I think I approximate this, but any given week, Daniel and I probably spent close to 12 hours together working on our project, talking about our lives, and really investing in each other as friends. And Daniel got a lot more time than my then fiance Kelsey did with me that semester, so it's needless to say that that's, again, that's a very important relationship to me and one that I, just cherish with so much of my heart. When it came time to decide what I was going to do after college, I was balancing these 2 choices of trying to heavily pursue going and taking a job at a game studio that's in this area, or doing the apprenticeship and joining the pastoral staff with Focus. It was a hard decision. I had to think a lot about it because on one hand, I had an opportunity to pursue my dream at one of the studios that I thought was making some of the most fun material out there, or I could follow what I felt like was a very present pull in the other direction to go into ministry and let God be more the driver of my life than the navigator, I guess, for lack of a better word. I still held the steering wheel in one vision, but I was okay with him guiding. But when I talked with Daniel about that, he helped me really think through, like, what were the positives, what were the negatives. But ultimately, at the end of it, he was just like, yeah, like, I think it'll be fun if you choose to do the one, but if you choose to go to Focus, I'm going to be your first supporter. I'm going to make that happen for you. And he was. So, and I can say, obviously, Daniel and I have not been perfect friends to each other. I'm painting a really cool picture of friendship. We've argued a bunch. We've debated a lot. Like, part of what sharpened us when we would talk about God was that we really wanted to, like, take the ideas we had already and make sure that both of us figured out how to be more right about God. But we approached it humbly, so it was not a lot of, like, stubborn, like two bulls hitting against each other. There was like I really do think about this about God, and this is why. And then we're like, okay, well, I think a little bit differently. But like all of that, like I said, really sharpened who we are as disciples today. And I say all of this and share this story because we're in a series called Relating to God. We've been talking about and looking at different relationships we have with God and talking about how we live in that, given that God wears a lot of hats with us. And it can be difficult to relate to someone who wears lots of hats. A couple weeks ago, Ariana talked to us about what it looked like to relate to God as our Father. And because he's our Father, that we're supposed to look like him and the intimacy and authority that he has in that role as Father. Last week, Brandon talked about God being God and relating to that, but also how that's like really good for us because God wants to bless us and he wants to have a really good relationship with us, but that we can't have that if we're living in rebellion against him. And this week I'm talking about viewing and relating to God as our friend. I know it can be hard at times to view Jesus, let alone God, in the role as a friend because of the authority that he has. We know that Jesus says, I want to be your friend, but we don't really understand what does that look like. It's like the best way I think I can explain the position God holds with friendship is like if your parent, like your dad or your mom said, I want to have a friendship with you. Obviously, whether we accept or deny that, they are still our parent. They still hold all the authority they have before. But we are given the opportunity to reciprocate and then develop a friendship there. It's an invitation they don't owe us, that God does not owe us, but one that he wants us to have. He wants us to have the opportunity to be next to him, to relate to him, and to have a kind of connection that I just shared about having with Daniel. So, in light of that, to kind of paint more of a picture of what is God like as a friend, I want to tell y'all a story about his interactions with one of his difficult, weird, extremely intimate, and very faithful friends named Abraham. I'm sure many of y'all, at least if you've been influenced by Abrahamic religions, know the story of Abraham. And at least the spark notes, right? We know Abraham came from Sumerian city. God called him out of that. He went. Now his descendants number like stars in the sky. God held all of his promises with that, and we have, a lot of the benefit of hindsight. Abraham only had trust, and he was faithful, and he's honored a lot in the Bible for that. But many, many intimate conversations happened between God and Abraham through the process of getting Abraham to the end of that covenant, to the end of that promise. I want to focus on one in Genesis 18 that I think really paints this picture of God both being in his place of authority and being in the place of a friend at the same time. This happens in Genesis 18. Where God and a couple of his angels are on their way to two cities I'm sure you've all heard the name of, called Sodom and Gomorrah. Famously terrible cities. But, along the way, God and his angels encounter Abraham. And Abraham asks, like, what are you going to do? And God shares with him he's going to pass judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham's like, well, what if you find, say, like 50 good people there? And God's like, okay, well, yeah, if there's 50 good people there, I won't destroy the cities. And he's like, yeah, but God, if you would be so kind as to listen to me, what if there's only 40? And God's like, yeah, well, I mean, if there's only 40, I'll spare the cities. And they go back and forth on that for a little bit and then land at Abraham being like, God, if you would just listen to your humble servant, what if there's only 10 people? And God says, okay, if there's only 10 people, the cities will be spared. And then they go their ways. Unfortunately, the story ends with there not being 10 good people, but there is an important point that is made here. God allowed Abraham to negotiate with him. I don't know if y'all know or how much y'all know about the pagan gods of that time. They were not known, and for years after, were still not known for being very negotiable people. They were painted as these people who would just enforce their will on the people, and the people just had to deal with it. And honestly, I say all that about the pagan gods, but God is within his right to do that. God is God. We talked about that a lot last week. If he wanted to just say, Abraham, shut up, I'm God, know your place, he was within his rights to do that. But he had already, up to that point, extended his friendship to Abraham. And with that came the opportunity for Abraham to talk with God and to negotiate and be like, God, I know you're a loving God. This is not within your character. Like, spare it for these people. And that's kind of a really big deal. Like, that kind of friendship that God would let a human, debate him in that sense. He offered that he does the same thing with Moses after the Israelites, put up their famous golden calf, and God, within his right, is like, these people are ridiculous. I don't think I want to hang out with them anymore. I think they've already proven they're not going to be faithful. I'm gonna dip out. And Moses is like, but God, you're the God that delivered them from Egypt. You're the God that they have to follow. And God's like, you're right. And so he stays. God talked with Abraham, Moses, and many other people through the Old Testament in ways that are just not the ways a God is supposed to interact with people, but they are the ways that a friend interacts with people. So much was God's relationship to Abraham. It meant so much to him that you get to the point of the prophets, and at least once or twice in Isaiah, when referring to Israel, God does not just call them his people or the people of Israel or the descendants of Jacob or the tribes of Jacob. He calls them the descendants of my friend Abraham. He uses those words very specifically because that's who Abraham was to God. He was his friend. And these are the kind of close friendships that God has invited us into. And these kinds of close friendships are not ones that are easily broken. Abraham did a couple of things, namely trying to take the covenant promise into his own hands and accepting an invitation to sleep with his wife's servant to get descendants because he didn't think that God would do it the way he promised. But God didn't let that betrayal of trust be the end of their friendship, nor did Abraham. They resolved that, they worked through it, and they came out continuing to have the good relationship they have. And I think it's the same you see happening with Jesus in the garden with his disciples. I had y'all read that story because I think it mentions a couple of moments where Jesus was really let down by his friends. You have the one hand at the start of the story where he's just going to pray, completely overwhelmed by grief, knowing he's being betrayed, people are on their way to arrest him, and knowing the burden that he's carrying. And he just asks his friends, keep watch for me, please. I need to go pray. And he goes to pray, and he comes back, and they're sleeping a couple of times. And he's like, why? Am I just not important enough to stay awake for? What is going on? What's the deal? And then he takes these same people. He's like, all right, come with me. The people are here to arrest me. And they go, and as soon as Jesus is arrested and taken off, everyone abandons him. Not a single one of them stays around to go to his trial. Not a single one of them is there when he's in jail, when he's beaten. And, only John can even make the claim that he was there when Jesus was dying on the cross. But the rest of them were just gone. It was not important enough to them. But their friendship was real enough that when Jesus came back, they all made good. They made right, given the opportunity to. And, that's a blessing for them that Jesus was who he said he was, because if he wasn't, that friendship would have ended in a pretty tragic way. But that friendship mattered, and it stood a pretty big test. So I say all these things, these couple stories, because I want to paint a picture for y'all that friendship is intimate. It takes a lot of pouring into. Friendship is something that we have to take really seriously, but it comes with a lot of the ability to change each other's minds, the need to talk to each other, the pouring out of grief to each other, the standing the test of life that inevitably we're going to make mistakes and hurt each other. And so, if we consider God our friend, when we see tests in life, we should not let those shake our friendship with him. Those of us who grew up Christian, I'm sure you all are coming to this. You've heard a million times that God calls us friend. And I want to ask you seriously, is God your friend? In all of this language that he uses, again, this is our God offering a branch to friendship. So you are God's friend. That's just flat out where we're at right now. But is he yours? In my story about Daniel, one key mark of our time together was that we were shaping and changing each other. The sound designer and disciple both that I was when I met Daniel and hung out with him for the first time couldn't hold a candle to who I was at the end of that time. Thankfully I was growing over a couple of years. I'm very glad to have not been stagnant in my life in either of those fields, but that's what friendship does. Daniel was someone who I was letting speak into my life, letting speak into my work and make them better. And the same happens when we have friendship with God. Our friendship with him changes us. He makes us a better lover of people. He makes us a more generous person, and just so many other things. And so, a key marker of if you can consider, God your friend, is if your relationship with God is changing you. God is not just a buddy who you hang out with and have a good time with. God is someone who's very intimately involved with you. That is the friendship he asks for and the friendship that is on offer. And it has to be reciprocated. And it's this reciprocation of friendship that really makes that friendship so intimate. We can't really call him friend if we don't put in the effort to spend time with him, can we? So I know, again, Peter just read for us John 15. And specifically in verse 15, the I no longer call you servants, I call you friends passage. We have this image of Jesus reaching out to his disciples as a friend. But that came at the end of a few years of them truly being his servants. That's why he has to start with the saying, I no longer call you servants. The relationship had changed. The relationship had grown and the relationship had deepened. And I'm sure some of you know the story in John 21, specifically in verses 15 through 19, where Peter and Jesus are having this bit of a back and forth, where Jesus is asking Peter, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, of course, Lord, you know I love you. There's an important thing happening in the Greek that I think our American translations kind of lack when hitting the impact of this passage, because the word Jesus uses the first and the second time he asks Peter that question is this word agape, that servant love. Do you love me as your servant loves their master? The love that is largely in our Christian faith painted to be the highest form of love. But Peter is not seemingly okay with that kind of love being the one he has with Jesus. Because Peter answers, yes, Lord, you know I phileo you, meaning the love that someone has for their friend. And so Jesus responds, well, Peter, do you agape me? And Peter says, no, Lord, I phileo you. And so they land on this point where basically Jesus says, Peter, are you my friend? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I'm your friend. And so I think it's important, though, to ask ourselves, like, does knowing Jesus has this kind of friendship with us, does knowing God has this kind of friendship on offer with us, actually produce anything in us? Does knowing God as our friend actually cause us to treat him like one or talk about him like one? You see, I think it's important for us to know in having a relationship with God that that relationship should be infectious. It's designed to be. See, I think to make this point clear, if any of you are involved in things or have like hobbies, groups, or like friends that you really like, you talk about that with other people. It's not something that you're very shy about when people ask you, like, what are you interested in, or what are you doing this week, or stuff like that. And so if we have a friendship with God, he needs to be included in those answers, right? I'm someone who can't help but talk about the things I find cool. And so since I'm the one with the microphone, I get to do that now. I'm very into my hobbies, very into the things I like. And two of those things right now, the nerdiest loves of my life are Warhammer and One Piece. And everyone who has a conversation with me eventually ends up having to hear about those. It comes out of me, Anyone talks about looking for a hobby or looking for a book or a show or just, trying to find ways to rest better. I'm like, oh, I've got these awesome things that have helped me do that, and I love talking about them. Let me share them with you. With that said, like, if God is someone I'm excited about, that friendship with God needs to have like serious implications on my like outreach and evangelism. The ways I'm talking with people need to be affected by that. I don't know if any of y'all can picture this, but I definitely have at times had two friends who I know don't know each other, but I'm just like, man, their personalities are so similar. They would be very fast friends. They would probably even be better friends than they are with me if I introduced them to each other. So if you actually thought sharing God with people would change their lives, wouldn't you do that? Like if you saw this person and you're like, man, like knowing God would be really awesome for them. Like they have so much of him in their heart already, they just don't realize it. God cares about so many of the same things that they do. Why not tell them about him? Like, why not show them that that's the reality of the situation? And I have to say from my own experience, this has been my like single most effective tool in talking about God with people who either, are not Christian or very much have chosen to be opposite of Christian, to be opposed to Christ. I don't want to spend too long on this evangelistic point, but this is something that matters to me a lot. I've watched a lot of things fail to resonate with people when we do outreach. People who are not in God's family don't care about all the rules, but we like to use those as the things that we talk with people about. You know what they do care about, though? Someone who loves them. And they care about, if they're my friends and they care about me, they care about the people that I love. And if God's included in that, they care about why I care about God. And it's that God who, to people who I know within the queer community, has like actually resonated. Like this God that I have this really personal relationship with, that I know loves me, that I can explain ways that I've seen his love for me played out. That sounds really attractive because it is really attractive. But like if I didn't have the friendship with God that I had, I don't think that I would be able to paint this picture of him that's anything more than maybe like a supervisor in my life. And people are not looking for another supervisor to add to their lives. So I ask again, like, you're all God's friends. Is he yours? It's story time again, so I'm going to tell you about a friend that I made when I was probably 3 or 4. I really don't know because I was too young to remember. But I became friends with a kid named Caleb around that time because our moms were, I'm pretty sure, in a Bible study together. And so we were being, watched, child cared together, and we just developed a really, flourishing friendship out of that. We grew up in church together. We were, there's a little bit of an age gap between us. He's a little bit over a year younger than me, but that meant for most of my life, we were involved in the same ministries, involved in the same, groups. There wasn't enough of an age gap that I thought, this guy's too young to hang out with me. I'm too cool to hang out with a 4-year-old as a 5-year-old. But yeah, that connection was super important to me a lot growing up. I mean, he was my very closest friend. We stayed close through middle school and through high school and even into college and even to now. When I got married, Caleb was my best man. That's the kind of ride or die friend that I have in Caleb. But our relationship has taken a bit of a turn because neither of us are as free or flexible as we once were. And, unfortunately, Caleb's relationship with God is in a very ebbing and flowing state. And that means that, we don't have the church connection that we once had either. But, in spite of all that, we're still friends because we've chosen to be. We're at a point in our life where friendship has a cost. We can't get time with each other whenever we want. Touch points aren't built into our life anymore like they were when we were kids. And so if I didn't care about that relationship, life would just pull us apart. It would just happen. But I do care about that relationship. And so we've built in the touch points. We've taken the time to work spots into our schedules where we can see each other. We sometimes stay up a little bit later than we should so that we can hang out online and play a game together. Yeah, we make sacrifices because that's what it takes to maintain a relationship. And friendship with God also has a cost. I don't know if you're aware, but you do have to make time with God to spend time with God. And I think we can think a lot about God has all these expectations for us to hang out with him. But I do want to remind you that God has paid a much bigger price for friendship with us than we are paying for friendship with him. And so, my needing to find an hour in my schedule every day so that I can hang out with God is not nearly as big a deal as God saying, I'm going to put my son on the line so that you can be with me. That's a much bigger payment for friendship put forward. And remember, God does not have to offer us friendship. I do want to make that very clear. This is a relationship that is on offer, that his authority of being God does not mean has to exist. And so we do have to put forward some effort if we want that relationship. So with all this said, what does this mean for our friendship with God? I want to remind y'all that friendship with God is really intimate. God doesn't want to be our buddy, but he doesn't want to be a distant ruler over us either. God wants and has invited us into an intimate, reciprocated friendship, and we just have the simple task of joining him. And again, like I said before, friendship with God is infectious. And I really could, talk about this point for hours and hours, and so to prevent myself, I'll say very little about it. It just should matter, how we talk about God. And if we have a friendship with God, I think we tend to talk about him pretty well. And the last implication, I think, is that friendship with God has a cost. We don't accidentally end up in a close friendship with someone. We have to choose to prioritize God over other things and make time for him. And it's going to be talked about a little bit next week, but God is jealous of the things that we choose to prioritize over him. Like, he's made that very clear in Scripture that friendship with the world is to make him your enemy. So you do have to think, like, what am I choosing to make a friend over God? Because we do choose a lot of things. So, it's my prayer for y'all that you would have a really vibrant friendship with God and that you would take steps to get that. But, those steps are things that we often think are really simple. Things like praying to God, spending time in silence and solitude with God. Talking with the people close to you about him. Learning to, trust his Spirit, to hear from him. But I guess, I know all of it can seem very simple and yet also very vague. And so, praise team, y'all can come up and get ready, because I'm going to share, a story, my own answer to my repeated question, I am God's friend, is he mine? With the answer, yes, God is my friend. And I can say that confidently probably only since 2015 that I've seen God as a friend. I was a Christian before that. I was baptized and born again years before that. But I think for a long time, I really just purely saw God in his Father role with me. I understood that a relationship with God had intimacy involved in it, and I understood that a relationship with God had authority involved with it. And so I treated him purely like that until, while I was on the leadership at Collin, we read a book called So You Want to Be Like Christ. It's a great book if any of y'all want to read it. I don't remember the author's name, so terribly sorry, but it's probably the only name or book by that name. So search it, So You Want to Be Like Christ. That book talks about a lot of ways that you can mimic Jesus in getting close with God. And it painted a very cool picture to me of what would prayer look like if made purposeful? What would silence and solitude mean for my relationship with God, my ability to hear from him? And out of that, over the next few years, I really started to see this reciprocated, good friendship form with God, where I started learning how to trust him with the things on my mind, started learning how to spend time with him, learning how to not be super distracted when I would pray, which is very hard for me even today. But I've learned so much even about the grace he has for me from that. That grace is a gift, and friends give gifts to each other, and that's a pretty good gift that God has offered us as our friend. But it's not been perfect. When I joined the pastoral staff here with Focus in 2019, I had a time where I think I got really obsessed with not only people's view of me, but also God's view of me. And that started to really break down the trust in that relationship. But luckily, I talked with people like Peter and Rhett and Brandon and was eventually able to get back to seeing God as my friend. Since then, I've trusted God with a lot of hard things on my heart. I've gone to him first in times of chaos. I shared in a sermon I did, last semester, but last year, my apartment flooded, and I had to move out for a few months. And I just remember being so freaked out and full of chaos in that moment. And I just was I guess I might as well pray to God. He cares. And I think it's that friendship that gets us to this point where we realize that he cares. And how real that is. That before I call my parents being hey, I need a place to stay, before I get a hold of my wife and be hey, this is what's going on, even before I get help in my apartment, he's the first person I can call. So yeah, I've learned to lean on him. I've learned to trust him with major decisions in my life. Like, I don't know how many of you are aware, but our staff, we make commitments for upwards of 5 years to stay at a campus, to be y'all's pastors, and to make sure that, like, we make a promise. We make a little bit of certainty for the future that, like, in 5 years, we will be here, and we will always be available to you as much as we can control. And I had to make that choice a couple of years ago. How long was I gonna stay? And it was a really hard decision for me to put a time to it, because I knew I wanted to be here. And I knew I wanted to be here for a long time, but it was really scary to think about, like, what does committing to 5 years look like? At that point, I had never committed 5 years of my life to anything. I guess other than being my parents' child. Like, that, I've been that longer than 5 years. But, at that point, I'd been married for less than 5 years. I'd never done a sport for more than 5 years. I'd never been at the same school for 5 years. Life changed faster than that, and so I was kind of scared of the decision. And so I trusted a lot of my friends with it. I talked with people like Peter and Lawrence and God about that decision, and ultimately came to the one that I did. And that's the kind of trust that I want y'all to grow into. That, like, these decisions that look like you're staring into the uncertainty, like, you can trust God with this. All right, I'm going to pray for y'all, and then we can get into some worship. God, I really pray for really good friendships with you. What you have on offer to us is just super unfair to you, but it's a really good thing, and I just pray that you give us all the things the opportunities we need to better explore the friendship you have on offer for us, and that we come to learn to see you the way that you've said you wanted to see us, that you call us friend. I pray that in your son's name. Amen.